Chapter 976. Phoebe's eyes lit up. He had been troubled by this matter for the past few days, and had forgotten that there was a real oracle living in his palace. That was the oracle of the most powerful goddess in the legends, the goddess of nature. Just as she said, if the goddess of nature was willing to help, there was nothing that couldn't be solved. As for the condition Gu Xingyin mentioned, it was simple. The good thing about being the emperor was that he could get whatever he wanted done immediately. A notice was sent to all the citizens of the imperial city. It was an introduction to a goddess, the goddess of nature. Actually, many people knew about this goddess, probably because they had heard of her legends. But wasn't she just a goddess from the legends? Why would they be sent such a thing? Many people curiously opened the small booklet and were immediately attracted by the beautiful illustrations and beautiful descriptions. In the booklet, there was a detailed record of the goddess of nature's position, domain, and some of her past deeds on this continent. Many people who saw it were shocked. These things were written so realistically, it was as if they had seen it with their own eyes. Moreover, some of the deeds in the booklet were indeed related to some famous events in history. This was something that the emperor ordered, and some of the more sensitive people had already noticed the emperor's intention. Could it be that the emperor suddenly had faith in the goddess of nature? Flipping to the back of the booklet, there was an order from the emperor. One day later, at St. Vita's Square in the imperial city, everyone would witness a miracle. Miracle. Just these two words were enough to make countless people go crazy. Even those who didn't believe in the existence of gods would be intrigued by the word gods. Below, there was a requirement to go to St. Vita's Square. That was, everyone had to pray to the goddess of nature tonight. Gu Xingyin didn't count how many people followed the instructions. She only felt an endless stream of faith flowing into her body. Her body was more stable, and her desolate temple was slowly repairing itself. She could already see the glory of the glorious era. The next day, since morning, there were people rushing to St. Vita's Square. Most of the people successfully entered the square, but some of them were blocked outside by an invisible barrier. This was a formation set up by Gu Xingyin. Only believers who possessed the power of faith of the goddess of nature could enter. No matter how weak the power of faith was, as long as they had prayed according to the book last night, it was impossible for them to not be able to enter this place. Many people who had the mentality of taking a look saw this scene, and a trace of conviction appeared in their hearts. With such means, could it be that the gods had really appeared? At noon, St. Vita's Square, which was large enough to accommodate tens of thousands of people, was filled with people waiting for the miracle. Even in St. Vit City, such a grand occasion could only be seen once every few years. Noon, which was the time when the miracle would happen according to the booklet. Hubert was a merchant in St. Vitus. He never believed in the existence of gods. He just wanted to see what was going on. It's already noon. Where's the promised miracle? He heard someone complain beside him. I'm just here to watch the show. TSK. Who would really believe in miracles? That's right. Schubert looked up at the sky and thought to himself, who would believe that? 10,000 chapters today for more to go. Today, I will make up for the 3 chapters 10 on the 26th. I need a monthly vote. From today until the 7th, there will be double monthly votes. If you have a monthly vote, please come and vote for Gao Lingji. Chapter 977. There was a sudden gust of wind in the sky. The wind was very gentle, soft and warm as it blew on everyone's body. It made them feel as if the trace of irritation that had risen in their hearts while standing in this bustling crowd had disappeared without a trace. Then the sky suddenly darkened. It was not that the sky was dark, but it was as if a layer of soft dye had been applied to the sky during the day, darkening it by a shade. There was a sudden commotion in the crowd. Schubert heard someone exclaim in surprise. Everyone seemed to be looking up at the sky. He looked up as well, and saw the most unbelievable scene in his life. Above the sky that was not dark, 2 things that everyone was very familiar with appeared, one on the left, and the other on the right. A round sun hung high in the sky on the left, shining brightly. A crescent moon hung upside down in the sky on the right, spreading a soft radiance. The sun and moon hung high in the sky. It was a marvelous sight. And beneath the 2 enormous radiant objects, something even more marvelous appeared. As if separated from the human world, a faint white mist appeared beneath the sun and moon, making everything seem ethereal and untraceable. Then, as if a skyscraper had risen from the ground, a magnificent temple that did not exist in the human world slowly appeared before everyone's eyes. Everyone's eyes were drawn to the high throne in the middle of the temple. A figure wearing a green robe sat upon the throne. Her body was shrouded in a layer of soft holy light, and no one could see her face clearly. They could only see a little bit of golden hair that fell to the hem of her robe, as well as the majestic scepter she held in her right hand. "My believers, are you calling for me?" She spoke. Her voice was clear and gentle, with a faint pressure that rang in everyone's ears. The goddess of nature. A low cry of surprise could be heard. Some could not help but feel reverence from the bottom of their hearts, and knelt before the figure. If there was a first, there would be a second. One after another, the tens of thousands of people in the square knelt in the direction of the throne. The figure on the throne did not say anything. She just sat there quietly. Then, a green figure appeared in the temple. It was the oracle. Beside her was a beautiful 9-colored deer. Someone recognized her. It was the oracle of the goddess of nature, who had been summoned into the palace by His Majesty. Everyone watched as the oracle walked into the divine throne. He lowered his head slightly, as if he was listening to something. Many people pricked up their ears, wanting to hear God's voice again. Unfortunately, this time they could not hear anything. Then, the oracle nodded and walked out of the goddess of nature's palace. The moment she walked out, the entire divine hall disappeared bit by bit, as if it had just appeared. That place became empty space again, as if nothing had ever appeared. The sky also regained its bright color, and the spectacle of the sun and moon in the sky also disappeared. Only the oracle was left standing there alone. But this time, the entire St. Vita Square was silent, and it was no longer as restless and noisy as before. No one had forgotten the scene that had just subverted their imaginations. They all looked at the oracle silently, curious about what she had just heard. Gu Xingyin did not disappoint them. She opened her mouth and said a piece of exciting news. Chapter 978. The goddess of nature has just granted me the ability to temporarily control the wind and rain. This is the blessing she has bestowed upon the Roth Empire. Gu Xingyin's voice sounded in everyone's mind. She raised the scepter in her hand and chanted an obscure incantation. A gust of wind blew past her. The sky darkened at a speed visible to the naked eye. This was different from the previous situation. The sky was gray, the prelude to an impending storm. Then, everyone watched as the terrifying lightning bolts and dark clouds moved towards the northwest. They moved further and further away, landing in every affected area. Gu Xingyin looked around at everyone, her voice resounding. The goddess of nature has never given up on any of her people. But now, the faith of the people on the continent has greatly disappointed her. Everyone looked at her in a daze. Everything that had happened today was simply too inconceivable. Someone had placed a fact in front of them. The gods that they had never believed in actually existed. This was simply a shock that overturned everything they knew. Gu Xingyin also knew that they needed some time to recover, so she just stood there quietly, waiting for them to come back to their senses. Louis Weiss's eyes burned as he looked at the woman standing in the most prominent position. Beautiful, powerful, and dazzling. The oracle of the goddess of nature. An existence that could listen to the teachings of the gods. Her image in his mind had never been so clear before. Suddenly, the sound of chanting came from somewhere. Louis Weiss listened carefully and found that it was a hymn praising the goddess of nature. It was like a tide. Slowly, some people began to hum along with that person. Gradually, more and more people began to hum. The scattered streams converged into a river. Then countless surging rivers finally gathered together to form a power that could shake the heavens and earth. Everyone in the square began to sing the hymn of the goddess of nature. Gu Xingyin knew that her goal had been achieved. The barrier around St. Vita Square quietly disappeared. Many people who didn't go in were shocked by the song, which was loud enough to resound throughout the city. They all asked what was going on. Then, through the mouths of those who had personally experienced this, the name of the goddess of nature began to spread. Gu Xingyin wore a smile on her face as she quietly disappeared into the crowd. As soon as she appeared in her palace, she was informed that His Majesty had summoned her. This was to be expected. Gu Xingyin arrived at the emperor's palace. It was rare for the place to be so formal today, and there were no beautiful maids serving Phoebe. As soon as he saw Gu Xingyin, a warm smile appeared on his face. "Oracle, I saw the miracle in St. Vitus Square, and I just received news from the northwest." Phoebit looked at Gu Xingyin with shining eyes. "I wish to establish the faith of the goddess of nature in the Roth Empire. I would like to seek your opinion, Lord Oracle." "That's a real god, you know." The moment he saw those miracles, there was only one thought in his mind. If such a powerful god was willing to protect the Roth Empire, if he was willing to protect the royal family, then the Roth Empire would be able to live on forever. This was the result that Gu Xingyin wanted, but there was one more thing that needed to be explained. Chapter 979. Gu Xingyin looked straight at Phoebit. "If I'm not mistaken, the Roth Empire believes in the god of war?" Phoebit's face showed a trace of awkwardness. Although their guardian was the god of war, none of the people had ever seen the god of war descend, and almost none of them still maintained their faith. He cleared his throat and said, "Our Roth Empire's guardian, according to the historical records, is the god of war. However, there are no records of the god of war blessing the Roth Empire. After seeing the goddess of nature descend, I doubt that the god of war even exists." Gu Xingyin thought, he originally existed, but because your faith collapsed, his power was lost bit by bit, and in the end, he had no choice but to fall into an eternal slumber. Saying that there was no god's blessing, in the end, it was the result of humanity's own actions. Of course, Gu Xingyin couldn't say that out loud. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, and then finally nodded under Phoebit's expectant gaze. "The goddess of nature will not refuse any believer." Phoebit was overjoyed. "I'll immediately give the order to build goddess of nature temples throughout the Roth Empire." Gu Xingyin smiled. "Then I'll have to trouble your majesty." As the emperor, Phoebit's efficiency was undoubtedly very high. His order was quickly passed down. Every first-class city, with St. Vitus as an example, must have at least 2 temples of the goddess of nature. Every second and third-class city must have at least 1 temple of the goddess of nature. As for the rest of the smaller cities, a temple must be built between 2 neighboring cities. It wasn't just Emperor Phoebit, but the people's enthusiasm for the construction of temples was also unprecedentedly high. Among them, the people of St. Vitus and the northwestern region were the most enthusiastic. The former was because they had seen the goddess of nature descend with their own eyes, while the latter was because they had personally felt the gospel brought by the goddess of nature. Gu Xingyin only felt an endless stream of faith gathering in her body. According to this trend, it was only a matter of time before they returned to their heyday. She also officially moved out of the palace, even though Emperor Phoebit repeatedly urged her to stay. This time, Emperor Phoebit didn't keep her because he had any improper thoughts, but because after seeing the strength of Gu Xingyin as an oracle, he felt that with such a strong person in the palace, his safety would be guaranteed. Even if he was given 100 guts, he wouldn't dare to lust for Gu Xingyin, who could directly communicate with the goddess of nature. In the end, Gu Xingyin decided to move out of the palace with the excuse that since the temple has been completed, as an oracle, it is only natural for him to live in the temple. He moved to the goddess of nature's temple in St. Vitus Square. Chapter 980. Although he knew that his subordinate and the oracle had no time to meet, it was impossible for them to be together without him knowing. But Royd was still a little unhappy. He had reminded Louis more than once not to get too close to Gu Xingyin. But he knew in his heart that if Louis could have a closer relationship with the oracle as his subordinate, the oracle would be more dedicated to the cooperation. But he just didn't want the 2 of them to be together. As long as he thought that one day Louis Vis and that oracle would become lovers, his heart would be filled with boundless tyranny and irritation. He didn't even know why it was like this. "I told you to wait." The door of the private room was pushed open, and a figure walked in. Louis's eyes lit up. In order to not be discovered, Gu Xingyin had changed her oracle outfit today. She was now wearing a very popular tight-fitting waistline dress. This design of the dress revealed her tall and perfect figure without a doubt. She wore a large lace hat of the same color on her head, which covered half of her face. She also held an exquisite pink folding fan in her hand. This style was the living embodiment of a noble lady. No one would associate her with the oracle in the temple, who seemed to have a spring breeze halo. Louis went up and extended a hand. "Welcome, Miss Bess." "Thank you, Louis." Gu Xingyin closed her folding fan and smiled as she placed her hand in Louis's palm. Louis's eyes lit up with a hint of menace as he leaned over and planted a gentle kiss on the back of her hand. Royd suddenly coughed heavily, interrupting the joyous atmosphere between the two. Louis looked at the Duke, who was acting strangely in confusion. Royd's eyes secretly glanced at the back of Gu Xingyin's hand. He suddenly stood up and walked toward Gu Xingyin with a cold expression. Louis nervously stood in front of Gu Xingyin. He couldn't be blamed. Royd's eyes were too scary. Those who didn't know would think that he was going to fight with Gu Xingyin. Royd glanced at Louis indifferently. "Move." Louis met those emotionless eyes. He clenched his fists and didn't move. Royd's voice dropped a notch. "Louis, move." He had accumulated a lot of power among his subordinates. Louis met those dark blue eyes and his Adam's apple moved uneasily. In the end, he unwillingly took a step back. He still stared at Royd without blinking. He swore in his heart that if the Duke wanted to harm Miss Bess, he would not sit idly by. On the other hand, Gu Xingyin's expression didn't even change. She looked at Royd calmly, as if she wasn't worried about him. What happened next was out of their expectations. Lloyd strode to Gu Xingyin's side, and the corners of his mouth curled into a stiff smile. He extended his right hand toward Gu Xingyin. "Welcome, Miss Bess." Louis was speechless. He was breaking down in his heart. It was just a welcome. Why did you have to look so fierce? Phew. Update 10. Chapter 981. Gu Xingyin looked much calmer than Louis Weisberg. She didn't seem to notice Royd's cold gaze as she smiled and winked. "Thank you, Your Excellency." Royd's frown deepened. She called him Louis Weiss, but she called him Duke. Did the difference in treatment have to be so obvious? He waited for her to extend her hand, but it was clear that Gu Xingyin didn't have any intention of doing so. Royd could only say impatiently, "Hand." Gu Xingyin was stunned. Seeing Royd's gaze on her left hand, she raised her hand in confusion. Then, Royd quickly grasped her hand and planted a kiss on the back of it. Gu Xingyin widened her eyes in shock. Louis looked at his superior in horror. Since when did His Excellency become so polite to a lady? After Royd finished, he quickly retracted his hand. Judging from his appearance, he seemed very unwilling to do what he had just done. "I didn't want to be rude," Royd said in his heart. "All right, Louis, we still have some things to discuss. You can leave first." Royd stood straight and mercilessly ordered his subordinate to leave. Louis was a bit reluctant, but he knew that there were some things he couldn't know. He glanced at Gu Xingyin and walked out with his head lowered. Gu Xingyin sat on a wide chair and quietly waited for Royd to speak. She thought that with this man's personality, he would definitely speak about serious matters. However, after a few minutes of silence, Royd spoke. "Your dress today is very beautiful." Gu Xingyin almost dropped the fan in her hand. She glanced at Royd in confusion and maintained a perfect smile. "Thank you for the compliment, Your Excellency." What was wrong with him? Grand Duke Royd wasn't a person who would exchange pleasantries. Looking at Gu Xingyin's strange and conflicted expression, Lloyd lowered his eyes. There was no joy on his face at all. Damned books. Didn't they say that a good conversation should start with a good topic? According to his knowledge, praising a woman's beauty, or praising her beauty, was undoubtedly the easiest way to gain their approval. But Royd was dismayed to find that this trick had no effect on the oracle of the goddess of nature. The other party was only puzzled for a moment, before his expression returned to normal. It was as if he didn't hear him. Next time, he must have a good talk with the person who wrote this book about life. Gu Xingyin saw that the atmosphere between the two of them had become awkward again. She could only sigh and take the initiative to find a topic to talk about. "Your Grace, you sent a message asking to meet with me. Is there something you need?" she asked. Seeing that the other party had taken the initiative to talk about business, Royd breathed a sigh of relief. He said with a cold expression, There are many goddess of nature temples in St. Vitus. We. The man's mellow voice resounded in the room. When he was talking about business, his handsome face was serious and could not be ignored. If a serious man was the most handsome, then this man was the most handsome at all times. I know a restaurant in the city. She doesn't have time. Royd coldly cut him off. Under Lewis's confused and gloomy gaze, Royd turned his head and looked at Gu Xingyin with shining eyes. Lady Beezy, please. Chapter 983. Gu Xingyin looked at Royd in surprise. She didn't understand when she had an appointment with him. However, this wasn't the right time to embarrass him. Gu Xingyin smiled and followed Royd's direction into the carriage. Royd didn't leave. He stood there and watched Gu Xingyin look at the carriage before turning to Louisville, who didn't know what was going on. Louis, he called out his subordinate's nickname. I know how you feel about her, but I'm warning you for the last time. Don't get involved with her. Royd's tone was very serious. Louisville didn't listen this time. Instead, he looked at his superior and asked, Why, Your Grace? I feel that Miss Bess is a very outstanding and beautiful woman. I have the freedom to pursue her. Why? Royd repeated these 3 words and suddenly smiled. Then I'll tell you. Royd looked at his subordinate and said word by word. Because she will be mine. After he finished speaking, he no longer paid any attention to his dumbstruck subordinate and strode towards the carriage. Because there was a lady in the carriage, Royd didn't get in out of respect. Instead, he rode his horse and followed beside the carriage. Under his command, the carriage slowly moved in a certain direction. A cool breeze brushed past his face and woke Royd up. He didn't expect that he would say that in front of his subordinates. In fact, he had never thought that he would have such feelings for the Oracle. He didn't even think about it before they met today. Perhaps it was the moment she said she could trust him, that something buried in his heart quietly sprouted. Royd was never someone who would run away from reality. Since he had such thoughts, he wasn't going to hide it from her or test her. Instead, he was going to tell her openly. What if she didn't like him? Royd refused to accept this possibility. Anyway, as long as he was around, no other man would appear by her side. Your Grace. A gentle voice came from the carriage. Can you explain to me where you're taking me? Royd could roughly guess the expression of the person in the carriage. She would probably frown slightly. She would at most show a hint of helplessness after such a rude thing was done to her. She would not be angry, let alone lose her poise because of it. Lunch, Royd replied. Gu Xingyin. When did she agree to have lunch with him? She said, Your Excellency, I didn't promise you. Royd's voice came through the thick curtains. I have something important to tell you. All right then. Gu Xingyin shut her mouth. If there was something, she wouldn't say much. But why didn't he tell her everything in one go in that room just now? The carriage stopped at a place. The curtain of the carriage was lifted, and a hand reached out. Gu Xingyin was startled. She put her hand on the hand, and used his strength to get off the carriage. Thank you, Your Excellency. She leaned to the side and thanked him. Royd felt the residual warmth in his hand, and felt a bit regretful that she took it back so quickly. You're welcome. Chapter 1000. Gao Lingji's first 1000 chapters novel was a very memorable number. Chapter 984. What's this? Gu Xingyin looked at his surroundings in surprise. She thought that the food he was talking about would be in one of the more famous restaurants in St. Vitus City. But this place, no matter how she looked at it, looked like an ordinary house. Royd walked straight ahead and gestured for Gu Xingyin to follow him. This is one of my courtyards. The servants who had received the news had already opened the door and tidied everything up, waiting for their master to arrive. As they walked, Royd introduced the place to Gu Xingyin. I have a chef who has been here for more than 20 years. His skills are comparable to those of the royal chefs in the palace. As Gu Xingyin listened to him, she was secretly surprised. Based on her understanding of Royd, he wasn't a talkative person. But now, he seemed to have unlimited enthusiasm, and was trying his best to find a topic to talk about. It was rare for the master to come, but this courtyard, which had been quiet all year round, seemed to be filled with life again. The two sat in the pavilion with exquisite snacks and drinks in front of them. All right, Your Grace, the important matter you mentioned? Gu Xingyin didn't forget that he had brought her here. That. Royd's lips twitched as he looked at Gu Xingyin, with an inexplicable expression. Gu Xingyin felt that there was something wrong with his gaze. She hurriedly communicated with the system. System, there hasn't been anything that's disadvantageous to me recently, right? The system's answer was very certain. No, host. That's good. Gu Xingyin relaxed and looked at Royd calmly. Then, she heard the man's thin lips slightly open as he said, I realize that I like you, BZ. Are you willing to rule the Rotter Empire with me after I achieve my goal? Gu Xingyin's first reaction was that something was wrong. She couldn't be blamed for feeling strange. After all this time, she had never felt any affection from Royd. She had once thought that this man did not have any romantic feelings in his heart. How could she have known that this confession would come so unexpectedly? So much so that her calm face cracked for a moment. Royd was very happy to see this. He always thought that Bai Si was used to being an oracle, and always maintained a compassionate and gentle expression. That kind of expression, compared to a person, was more like a deity without any worries or emotions. He was very happy to see her surprised expression. This way, she would be closer to a human. Gu Xingyin came back to her senses and met Lloyd's burning gaze. He looked at her without blinking. It seemed that he was determined to get an accurate answer from her. Actually, Royd wasn't as strong as he appeared to be. He had never liked anyone before, so he didn't know what kind of development was right. He had already made sure that no one of the opposite sex was around her, so that he was the only one in her line of sight. However, he couldn't guarantee that she would fall in love with him. Gu Xingyin was stunned for a few seconds. Suddenly, a completely different and human smile appeared on her face. It was a smile that Royd liked very much. What a coincidence. I happen to like the Duke very much too, she said slowly. Today, after washing my hair, I had a migraine attack and couldn't write anymore. In one night, I barely wrote 4,000 chapters. I'm really sorry. Including the one I owed previously, I owed a total of 5 chapters. Gigi promised to make up for it in the future. I'm sorry to ask for your votes today. _% good night everyone. Chapter 985. Such a straightforward admission stunned Royd. Of course his face, which only had one expression all year round, was stunned. But the shock in his heart was indescribable. When he said that sentence, he was prepared to receive any response. Moreover, in his heart, he believed that the possibility of rejection was quite high. Lloyd knew himself well. He knew that the most attractive aspects of him to women were none other than his noble status, great wealth, and handsome looks. In the eyes of this oracle, these 3 things were not enough to attract her. Then personality? Royd shook his head inwardly. He knew himself very well. With his personality, he was definitely not the type to be liked. Gu Xingyin looked at the tense and expressionless face in front of her, as if he was thinking. But she knew that at this moment, this man was probably just in a daze. She used the fan to cover half of her face and called out, Your Excellency the Duke? Royd quickly came back to his senses. Call me Royd. Gu Xingyin blinked, and went along with his wishes. Royd. Sure enough, it sounded much better than Your Excellency the Duke. Royd thought to himself silently. In an instant, Royd came back to his senses. He looked at the smiling woman in front of him, and suddenly stood up. Wait here for a moment. Then he turned around and strode away. What kind of development was this? At this time, as the man who confessed first, shouldn't he say some sweet words to coax her? Gu Xingyin put down the fan in her hand, and took a sip of the tea on the table. System, what do you think he's doing? The servants in this courtyard did not dare to approach her, so she could only talk to the system. The system indicated that it did not want to answer this kind of question, but it didn't seem good to leave the host hanging. Moreover, what if in the future, thinking of a possibility that was almost the truth, the system felt that its attitude could be better to the person in front of it? Host, the system feels that, according to human logic, it will be a pleasant surprise, the system replied. Gu Xingyin was actually just bored and chatted with the system. As the system had been single for 10,000 years, Gu Xingyin did not think that it would be able to give any constructive suggestions. Forever single system. Gu Xingyin asked, how is he doing? When it came to work, the system's actions were much smoother. A long string of information quickly entered Gu Xingyin's mind. It was He's recent experience, and it was very detailed. Just as Gu Xingyin had expected, without the powerful goddess of nature, He's days were not very good. She was still the oracle of the water god who had long fallen into a deep slumber. An oracle without the protection of a god could be seen by referring to the current situation of the Kapuna family, where Louis was from. Needless to say, the entire Roth Empire was now slowly gathering the faith of the goddess of nature. This was also imperceptibly weakening the influence of the remaining gods. Naturally, He's days were even more difficult. Being forced to live had already consumed all of her energy, not to mention that her ambition was growing day by day like in the original plot, and she even wanted to replace the position of the goddess of nature. All He wanted now was to be able to live a comfortable life like before. In a different position, the things one wanted would be completely different. This was indeed the case. No, I won't marry anyone else. I swear to the goddess of nature that my husband will only be you. Chapter 987. Royd's face was stiff as he held Gu Xingyin's hand in his. If one took a closer look, one could see that his ears were slightly red. He said in a low voice, "Shouldn't the man say it first?" Gu Xingyin didn't give him face this time and laughed out loud. By the time the two of them had finished their heart-to-heart talk, a sumptuous lunch was already prepared. After the two finished their lunch, they enjoyed the scenery for a while before Royd sent her back to the temple in St. Vitus Square. "Goodbye, Royd." Gu Xingyin turned around and said to him. This was the back of the temple, where Gu Xingyin usually lived, and no outsiders could come in. Lloyd suddenly strode toward her, leaned over, and kissed her on the cheek. His actions were done in one smooth motion. The book says that couples can have some intimate interactions when they say goodbye, he said with a straight face. Gu Xingyin looked at his red ears, held back her laughter, and copied him. She tiptoed and kissed him on his left cheek. Royd turned around and left satisfied. When he returned to his duke's mansion, the butler reported that Count Louis had been waiting for a long time. Lloyd had long expected that Louisvis would come. He took the horsewhip in his hand and threw it to the butler, then went straight to the study. "Your Grace." Louise greeted him as soon as she saw him, but she didn't know what to say after greeting him. Ever since the two of them left in the morning, he had been in a daze. How could the Duke say something like that? He thought for a long time, and finally decided to come to the Duke's mansion to ask. But the butler told him that the Duke wasn't there. He waited for a few hours. He had a lot of questions to ask. What did the Duke mean by what he said earlier? Did he really have a relationship with Miss Bess? Even if they were out for so long, were they dating? But when he saw Royd, he found that he couldn't ask at all. Royd sat calmly in his seat and looked at his subordinate's conflicted expression. He didn't feel guilty at all. If he was not mistaken, Louis had liked Bai Si for a long time. But all his time was spent on hesitation and cautiously approaching. When it came to such matters, once he had made up his mind, he should act decisively, regardless of the outcome. If the other party also liked him, it would naturally be a happy ending. If the other party had no feelings for him, Grand Duke Royd said that he would try his best to make the other party like him. That was how domineering they were. If you drag things out and end up with nothing in the end, who can you blame? He waited for a while to make sure that his subordinate still had no intention of speaking. "Louis." He called out his subordinate's nickname in a deep voice. The two of them were about the same age and had grown up together. The Kapuna family had always been his loyal followers. Although the two of them were superior and subordinate, they were more like brothers most of the time. Of course, if Royd was referring to his brother, King Phoebe, then his relationship with Louis Weiss was much better than that of blood brothers. Louise stood up straight out of reflex and looked at Royd. "What do you want to ask me?" Louis's heart trembled, and his gaze finally became firm. Chapter 988. What's your relationship with Lady Bai Si? Louis asked. Royd nodded. As you thought, we're together. Louis's gaze trembled, and he felt his heart empty for a moment. He forced a smile. Is that so? Then I wish you. Having just found out that his sweetheart was someone else's lover, One could imagine the dejection in Louis's heart. He still couldn't say the words of blessing out loud. But Roy didn't care about this. He looked at his good brother and spoke without a trace of euphemism. I'm well aware of your feelings for her. I don't care about how it was in the past. But from today onwards, Louis, you have to put away these thoughts and suppress them. You have to remember she's mine. Louis forced a smile. Of course I know that. He still had a bit of moral integrity, but he still felt some regret in his heart. It was the first time in his life that he was moved by a woman, but he couldn't even confess. Roy trusted his brother's character, and telling him was just a declaration of male sovereignty. After settling his private matters, Roy began to put his thoughts on business. His actions were already not slow, but now there was another motivation to push him forward. He wanted to make himself embassy official as soon as possible. With his current situation, if he married by sea, Phoebe would definitely start to doubt, and even reject by sea. The current faith in the goddess of nature had not yet fully grown, and if Phoebe was determined to resist the divine right, it would definitely cause a storm, and by sea's previous efforts would basically be in vain. Gu Xingyin roughly understood her thoughts, and the various activities in the temple began to become more frequent, and there was even another god's descent. Sure enough, Phoebe began to firmly believe in the goddess of nature, and there were more and more believers in the Roth Empire. There were even many people who spontaneously went to the temple to pray regularly and requested to hold a ceremony for the goddess of nature. The so-called ceremony was a large-scale event. On the day of the god's birthday, prayers would be held, and believers would offer their loyal faith and carefully prepared gifts for the god. Phoebe hesitated for a moment. He had already begun to realize that the development of the divine right seemed to be somewhat out of control. When he accepted the faith of the goddess of nature, his initial purpose was to make it serve the royal authority. But now, the goddess of nature was showing signs of surpassing the royal authority. This kind of thing was intolerable to anyone in power. However, how could Gu Xingyin let him disagree? The holy water bestowed by the goddess of nature allowed Phoebe's weak body to regain its strength. It also made his faith in the goddess go up a notch. With a wave of his hand, Phoebe passed the case. Gu Xingyin looked at all of this with a smile, feeling the power of faith from the Roth Empire surround her. The light spots were of different colors and represented different emotions. Green represented comfort, yellow represented fear, gray represented despair, and red represented anger. These were the emotions of the believers of the goddess of nature. Gu Xingyin only needed to feel them slightly to be able to clearly hear their inner thoughts. But it was very clear that in the sky, the proportion of green light spots was getting smaller and smaller, and the proportion of yellow and gray was gradually increasing. Phoebe's rule made these people unable to see a trace of hope. Wait a little longer, Gu Xingyin said softly in her heart. Soon, there will be a person who will lead his army to rescue you from this mire of despair. Chapter 990. Time passed by quickly. When the harvest season of the second year arrived, the people of the Roth Empire welcomed the goddess of nature's festival. Gu Xingyin made ample preparations for this. Emperor Phoebe had also made sufficient preparations. He still hoped that this ceremony would be able to calm the restless people down. As the most famous oracle of the goddess of nature, Gu Xingyin stayed at the goddess of nature's temple in St. Vitus City. As for the festivals in other places, they were also handled by different oracles. Gu Xingyin had already discussed with Roy that they would bring a big gift to Phoebe and the entire Roth Empire. On this day, Gu Xingyin was dressed very formally. Phoebe also led the royal family to the goddess of nature's temple in formal attire to show their respect. The huge square of the temple was already densely packed with believers. Among these believers, some were nobles in bright clothes. They wore exquisite clothes, and the ladies even sprinkled perfume, competing with each other to the side. Most of them were ordinary people. The only thing they could do was to wear clean and tidy clothes, so as not to tarnish the goddess of nature's festival. Gu Xingyin even saw homeless people on the streets, who only had one set of clothes. In the cold wind of late autumn, they took off their clothes and carefully washed them, smoothed them out, and hung them out in the sun. At night, they slept in a pile of hay shivering. Many of the believers put their treasures into a huge container in the middle of the square. This container was used to store the gifts that the believers gave to the goddess of nature. It was a huge transparent glass container, and when things were put inside, they could be seen clearly. Some nobles put their favorite jewelry inside. Some merchants put a bag of gold coins inside. Some young girls put their favorite flowers inside. And some children gave their favorite toys to the goddess. They looked like they were about to cry, because their mothers told them that they must give their most precious things to the goddess. There were even farmers in simple clothes who put a small bag of food. For them, food that could keep them from starving was the most precious thing in the world. Gu Xingyin kept a smile on her face as she watched all this, until the clock tower's bell rang, signaling the start of the festival. At this moment, everyone in the square saw a green light sprinkle down from the sky, falling on everyone's body. Being enveloped by this green light, everyone felt their body and mind relax. Then, the glass container that carried the good wishes of the believers suddenly became empty. The gifts that were given to the gods also disappeared at the same time as the green light disappeared. The goddess of nature has received your gifts, Gu Xingyin said to her believers with a smile. Immediately, a burst of loud cheers erupted from the square. Phoebe was a little dejected. Chapter 991. An ancient and mysterious hymn sounded from the altar. The believers looked at the indistinct green-robed figure on the altar with pious eyes. In the eyes of the believers, who could not possibly come into contact with God, the oracle was the closest person to God. The hymn ended. The entire square fell into silence. Everyone held their breaths, waiting for a miracle to happen. Gu Xingyin lowered his head slightly and glanced at the crowd below. The tens of thousands of people all did the same thing. They crossed their hands in front of their foreheads, hoping that the God they believed in would look after them. She smiled, and then her figure suddenly changed. In everyone's eyes, even those who couldn't see clearly with their eyes, they could clearly see the figure on the altar that was very far away from them. Her golden hair quickly grew and soon reached her ankles. The green robe on her body changed, and the green leaf embroidery on the robe sparkled. Her eyes became emerald green, and an indescribable gorgeous crown appeared on her forehead. In her hand, she held a golden scepter. Her face was beautiful and exquisite, but it could not stay in anyone's mind for even a second. Gu Xingyin's green eyes, which seemed to contain everything in the world, slowly swept through the crowd below. Being stared at by such a gaze, everyone had an impulse to prostrate themselves in worship. Greetings, my believers. A voice as cool as water slowly brushed past everyone's eardrums. God, like a tide, everyone knelt down with fanatical expressions. The gods had actually heard their calls and had descended upon them. At this moment, no one doubted that the person standing on the altar was a god. With such dignity, with such a gaze, how could she not be a god? Even Phoebe could not resist following her instincts and unwillingly knelt down in front of Gu Xingyin. Then, she felt the gaze of the gods fall on her. Phoebe did not dare to look up. She was a bit excited and did not know what God wanted to say to her. She felt that she could immediately declare that next year, no, starting tomorrow, she would build more goddess of nature temples in the Roth Empire and continue to pass down the faith of the goddess. The goddess of nature spoke. Ruler of the Roth Empire, why do you not treat your people well? What? Phoebe was stunned. The goddess of nature continued. Every day, I see the poor without clothes on their bodies, hear the cries of babies, and wanderers begging for a place to stay. Ruler of the Roth Empire, you are making your people suffer. Phoebe only felt a huge divine power descending on her body. Her face became pale, and she could fall to the ground at any time. But she still insisted. They are just a few lowly commoners, God. How can you doubt me because of them? Lowly commoners? The voice of the goddess of nature resounded throughout the Roth Empire. In my eyes, there is no such thing as wealth or poverty. Those who believe in me are my people. Many people had tears in their eyes because of this sentence. Yes, they were not lower than anyone else. At least in the eyes of the gods, they were not inferior to anyone else. Phoebe felt a chill all over her body. Then he heard God's indifferent voice. Phoebe is unworthy of being the emperor of the Roth Empire. Seeing the chapter number of 1008, she had the urge to write 10,086. Did he really think that she was dead? Just as the soldier's sword was about to fall, a bolt of lightning suddenly descended from the sky and struck straight at him. Not even his bones remained. Gu Xingyin used this move to intimidate them. She had also used her blood to prove that the goddess of nature was not without a temper. It's a divine punishment. The gods will not abandon us. The believers all knelt down in excitement at this scene, murmuring praises to the goddess of nature. Phoebe returned to the palace with an ashen face. However, things weren't over yet. Phoebe, who had just returned to the palace, received the news. Grand Duke Royd had rebelled. Chapter 993. Fibbit ordered the Empire's army to fight. The result could be imagined. One side had been preparing for a long time, and the other side had been fighting in a hurry. One side's morale was strong, and the other side had just been abandoned by the gods. The Empire's army was retreating in defeat. What was even more infuriating was that the people of the Empire were not angry at the rebels at all when they heard the news. They maintained a rare silence, and they were even happy to see such a situation. After all, the current emperor was someone who had been reprimanded by the gods themselves. At the beginning, Phoebe was still furious, and the atmosphere was extremely tense. But now, he had begun to feel powerless and afraid. His brother's army was coming over aggressively. His army was retreating in defeat, and they were about to reach the imperial city. At that time, he would have no way out. Duke, there's a messenger from the imperial city. Royd was sitting in the camp in his military uniform. He gestured for his subordinates to bring the person up. The messenger's legs were a little weak in the face of the murderous soldiers. He took out the letter in his hand in trepidation. It was Fibbit's handwritten letter. The letter described the sincere feelings between the two brothers very sincerely. He was very sad about Royd's actions. He also said that as long as Royd was willing to turn back and admit his mistakes, he would definitely let bygones be bygones, and was willing to rule the empire with him. Royd read it expressionlessly, and threw it to his confidant. My brother the emperor is still putting on the airs of an emperor. Louis read it at a glance, and was a little speechless in his heart. His Majesty's brain didn't seem to be very clear. At this time, he still couldn't recognize the situation. Let bygones be bygones. Did he really think that the initiative was still in his hands? Royd looked at the messenger coldly. Go back and tell His Majesty Emperor Fibbit that Royd thanks him for his good intentions. We'll meet in the imperial city. This was a clear rejection. The messenger wiped the sweat on his forehead and went out. The aura of this duke was too strong. He looked at him coldly, and he really thought that the other party would behead him in the next moment. Fortunately, he managed to keep his life. But the duke's reply. The messenger thought about His Majesty's temper, and deeply felt that if he replied like this, he was afraid that he would lose his little life that he had painstakingly saved. He pondered for a moment. Since his wife and children were in his hometown, why not take advantage of this opportunity to escape and return home to avoid trouble? With that thought in mind, the horsewhip in his hand subconsciously changed direction, and the horse galloped in the opposite direction of the imperial city. In the palace, Phoebe did not receive a reply. He would never have thought that it was his messenger who ran away, because he was afraid of angering him. He would think that Royd didn't accept his suggestion and killed the messenger. Damn it! Damn it! Refusing a toast only to drink a forfeit. I've already taken a step back, yet he's still not satisfied. Phoebe paced back and forth in the palace. He was annoyed, and another set of new tea sets on the table was scrapped. The maids lowered their heads and kept quiet out of fear. They were afraid that His Majesty's anger would spread to them if he was unhappy. Fortunately, Phoebe was not in the mood to find trouble with these maids. He watched as time passed day by day. When Royd's army finally arrived outside the imperial city, Phoebe could no longer sit still. Chapter 994. Royd received a letter from his elder brother. This time, the emperor who thought highly of himself finally put down his pride and spoke with a pleading tone. But Royd didn't want to talk to him anymore. 2 days later, Phoebe sat in the palace. Beside him were his only trusted subordinates. His wife and children were killed by him, and most of the maids in the palace had run away. In his current situation, he could be considered a loner. Royd, my brother. When he saw Royd, he actually wasn't as hysterical and angry as he had imagined. This made Royd raise his eyebrows. It seems that his brother wasn't completely useless. At least he could still maintain his composure in this situation. Phoebe silently stared at him for a while, then suddenly smiled strangely. Royd, you must be very proud of yourself right now, right? He said. Royd didn't say anything. Phoebe didn't want an answer either. He just continued. I'm telling you, Royd, don't be proud. I didn't lose to you. And don't think you have everything under control. If it wasn't for the goddess of nature's words that made my people stop supporting me, do you think you could have easily conquered the palace? So what if you've taken the throne? This is no longer the era of imperial power. As long as that high and mighty god says a word, you can be like me, falling from your high and mighty position into the dust. He laughed in schadenfreude, his eyes flashing, as if he could already see Lloyd's miserable future like his. Royd didn't answer his question. Seeing that Royd didn't care, Phoebe just smiled. Blood flowed out from his mouth. He laughed loudly and sat on the high throne, losing his breath. Duke. A subordinate who came with Royd carefully asked him what to do. Royd looked away and said, clean it up and give it a proper burial. While everyone was cheering and organizing the spoils of war, Royd came to St. Vitus Square alone. The goddess of nature's temple here was the largest temple in the entire Roth Empire. He walked through countless devout believers and went straight to the back. There was someone waiting for him. You're here? Gu Xingyin stood in the garden and turned around when she heard the noise. She didn't seem surprised at all to see him and smiled. Seeing her, Royd felt his chaotic thoughts calm down at once. A power that came from the bottom of his heart urged him to quicken his steps and walk to the woman's side. Then under her surprised gaze he hugged her. He sighed in satisfaction, his heart completely calmed down. Gu Xingyin turned her head and looked at the man who rarely showed such weak emotions. She didn't say anything and quietly waited for him to recover himself. After a long while, Royd released her and looked at Gu Xingyin. Now that Phoebe is dead, this empire belongs to you and me, he said. Bais, do you want this empire? He asked. Gu Xingyin suddenly raised her head to look at the man. She was still the young lady, who had no sense of existence in the Qiao family. Because she didn't have the talent for cultivation, her father ignored her. Her mother put all her energy on her newly born sister, who was tested to have a Xian grade aptitude. Footsteps could be heard approaching the ancestral hall. Gu Xingyin watched calmly. Now that she was affected by her strength, her divine sense could only see within 3 meters of her. The door of the ancestral hall was opened a little, and a thin and weak figure squeezed in. Her face was delicate and pale. The red mole between her eyebrows made her face brighten up. Jojo. Gu Xingyin immediately recognized her. It was mentioned more than once in the original story. Jojo was most proud of the red beauty mole between her eyebrows. Seeing this, Gu Xingyin couldn't help but touch her face. Between Shirlingsher's eyebrows, there was a cinnabar mole in the same position. The biggest possibility was that in the original plot, this boy's aptitude was never discovered, and he lived a miserable life. The little boy stared at the bonfire intently. This place could bring him warmth, and there would be delicious food later. Suddenly, an old voice rang in his ears. What's your name? Ah. He raised his head in panic and looked around. There was no one around. Then where did the voice just now come from? He could not help but move closer to the bonfire, thinking of the vivid stories of ghosts he heard outside the tea house during the day. It can't be haunted, right? Gu Xingyin looked at his frightened appearance with amusement. The bonfire in his body was a little too close. If he moved a little closer, his clothes would burn up. Gu Xingyin accepted his salute. Somehow, she felt that there seemed to be karma that had fallen on her. This meant that the heavenly Tao had acknowledged their relationship. What's your name? She asked for the second time. The little boy hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. I don't have a name. Everyone calls me little beggar. How could a little beggar who couldn't even guarantee food and clothing have the mind to give himself a name? Gu Xingyin thought for a moment. Since you've taken me as your master, I'll give you a name. According to the seniority of my disciples, you should be from the Yin generation. You'll be called Yin Sui. Are you willing to take my surname? The little boy's eyes lit up. I'm willing. Good, then you'll be called Gu Yin Sui.